Good afternoon. We are here today with this title, it is Stranded Assets, Which Path to Follow. I would like to thank you everybody to be here. We have an honor today we have this discussion of very interesting paper with Adrian Schilbe and Anastasia Skepapadeas. So the presentation of today is inside the DeRisco project. It is means a disclosure, measurement, management, mitigation of climate change risk for companies. DeRisco is a research and outreach project seeking to engage firms in climate disclosure issues. In particular, intends to raise firms and financial operation awareness on climate-related risk and opportunities and their financial impact, contribute to scientific debate on this matter, and then monitor the evolution of scenario analysis tools and methodology. This was inside also the FACTS project in FEMA, coordinated by Professor Stefano Pariglio. Is organized by Fondazione Enrico Mattei in collaboration with Forum per la Finanza Sostenibile and Chapter Zero Italy, the Net Community Climate Forum, with the support of SAIPEM, A2A, ACEA, ANRA, Generali, Unipolsai, e Utilitali. So we have, as I said to you, we have the honor to have here Adrian Schilbe. He is a climate change economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. His work focuses on the design of effective and politically acceptable emission reduction policies. So it's how to align and this implementation with local development goals and the long-term decarbonization imperative while navigating the political economy. It also works on quantifying the effects on policies that build socio-economic resilience to natural disaster and climate change, and on methods to facilitate decision-making under deep uncertainty. And the discussion will be, it is a very honor to have here Anastasia Skepapadeas, that is Professor of Economics at the Department of International and European Economic Studies of Athens University of Economics and Business, and the Department of Economics of the University of Bologna. He is also international member of the US National Academy of Sciences, and is a past president of the European Association of Environmental Resource Economists, past chair of the board of directors of Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. He's also published more than 130 papers in leading journals collecting volumes, among them American Economic Reviews, and most of the most important journals that are in our topic. So now I leave the floor to the presenter and also the discussant that we have the honor to have here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. That's a great introduction. Very happy and honored to be here. Can you just confirm that you see my screen and that you hear me so that I continue? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So as Sergio just said, I work at the IDB. We work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and under the Vision 2025 of the current administration of the IDB, we prioritize climate action as one of the 5 ways to help countries engage in a sustainable post-COVID recovery. And today I'm going to talk about a subset of that and of my job in the region, which is about producing knowledge that's relevant for governments to navigate the climate change agenda. And I'll try to make 3 points. First, just for context, I'd like to talk about net zero emissions and how the risk of stranded assets is one of the challenges in the transition to net zero. Then I'm going to present the paper that Sergio mentioned, that specifically about how carbon taxes can create stranded assets and other policy instruments can avoid the creation of stranded assets. And then as a conclusion, I'd like to just give you a quick peek at the kind of work we do with governments that show that in practice, the problem is much more complex and that governments need to look at a very wide range of policy instruments to go to net zero. So maybe let me start with something that's absolutely not related to climate change. Like, did you know that when the British Empire abolished slavery in the 19th century, they used 40% of the budget of the government at that time, which was 20 million pounds at that time, equivalent to more than $20 billion today, to basically pay compensations for the owners of plantations in the whole empire. I think this is an example. The book dealing with losers starts with this example. It's a very bold example of how sometimes bold and ambitious policy reforms require to navigate the political economy. Acknowledge that there will be losers, and even if the losers are not the good guys, you may need for political economy reasons to look at them and compensate them. And climate change is an example of such ambitious policy reform, because maybe the most important thing you should know if you don't work on climate change is that to put an end to climate change, we need to get to net zero emissions of CO2 globally by around 2050. Here I'm showing a plot from the IPCC report on the 1.5 degrees, and it shows on the y-axis emissions of CO2 from a human economy globally, and on the x-axis time, and all the scenarios that go to 1.5 degree, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement that now is emphasized in the international community. They go to net zero emissions on or around 2050. And the good news is that we know that from a technological perspective, even if it may sound a bit crazy at first, it's actually doable to get to net zero emissions. Basically, I illustrate this here with this plot in the middle that shows where greenhouse gas emissions come from in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the region I focus on, but that would be similar at the global level. We know that renewable energy coupled with electric vehicles and the electrification of energy uses in buildings, as well as public transport, cycling, walking, is basically what you need to remove emissions from the energy system. And from the food system, we know that updating agriculture practices and diets to consume less beef and have more room for reforestation is basically technically doable to get to net zero emissions. And I just covered most of emissions in the region and also most of the emissions globally. Of course, there's a few small other things to do, like green steel, green hydrogen, construction method, and waste management. Also, the second piece of good news is that a lot of this transition is economically doable because the technologies are getting cheaper and because they come with a lot of co-benefits. So here, for instance, on the left, you see a plot of the cost of generating electricity with several technologies around over time. And you see that the price of solar and the price of wind has dropped dramatically. Today, they are the cheapest source of energy that humans have access to globally and in history. And they already represent more than 90% of global investment in power generation. In the middle, you see a plot of battery prices also dropping, meaning that electric vehicles are more and more affordable. And, public transportation also comes with the advantage of reducing congestion. In the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's up to 3% of GDP that's wasted in terms of time people wasted in congestion. And also, of course, clean air is a key example of that people typically give of co-benefits. And IDIDB, I just wanted to show you very quickly the 3 covers of 3 studies that we've done for Costa Rica, for Chile, for Peru, that show it's technically doable to go to net zero emissions by around 2050, and it would have more benefits than costs. So $40 billion of net benefits in Costa Rica, 5% of GDP net benefits in Chile, $140 billion of net benefits in Peru. I invite you to go ahead and download those studies if you want to know more about it. But so I'm just saying we need to go to net zero emissions. It's technically doable. It's economically doable in general, but there are challenges. One of the challenges is stranded assets. Let me tell you, we have this other study from Latin America and the Caribbean, and I've also a similar study at the global level. If you just look at existing coal and gas power plants, and you look how old they are, maybe they're 10 years old or 15 years old, and you say, and you look at the emissions that they would emit over the lifetime if you keep them for the typical lifetime, so about 30 years, they will already emit more CO2 than what the IPCC suggests is a good amount of CO2 emitted by the power sector if you want to reach 1.5 to 2 degrees. And if you add on top of that the emissions from the announced power plants, then it's even doubled. So that says all of these assets maybe you will need to close them before those 30 years of typical lifetime, which is one way to transform them into stranded assets. And another example, and I guess I'm done like advertising all the work we've done, is that we've looked at a study, we've done a study of what it would mean for jobs in Latin America to go to net zero by 2050. And we find you could create about 20 million jobs in renewable energy and plant-based food if you do the diet shift. But at the same time, you would destroy 4 million jobs in fossil fuels and in cattle. So I'm saying there's winners and losers, and those losers, they come in part from the fact that you have to downside fossil fuels, cattle, so like the industries that are very carbon intensive. So it's in this context that we wrote a paper that was published in the GM a few years ago on looking specifically at the transition and how different policy instruments can precipitate the creation of stranded assets, or on the contrary, avoid the creation of stranded assets. So what we do in this paper that I'm going to present in detail in the next 10 minutes maybe, it's to establish that when you want to transition from polluting to clean capital, of course, in absence of other externality, a carbon price is going to be the socially optimal way to enforce the transition. But one downside, or one feature maybe of carbon prices, is that they can cause underutilization of the existing capital, polluting capital. So meaning, for instance, you have coal power plants, you stop using them, or you have SUVs, you stop using them, and reduce the revenues of the people who own them. And then we show that other instruments, such as fee-based. So fee-based, for instance, would mean subsidizing the investment in renewable power and taxing the investment on the coal power plants and gas power plants, or subsidizing the buying of new electric cars and taxing the buying of new gas guzzlers, which is something a lot of countries in Europe and the US do, for instance. So these instruments, they can also help you transition to clean capital, but without creating those stranded assets. So here's how we model this. I'm going to pass all the, I'm passing all the animations because I understand you see them with a delay. So we have a model where you create output from two types of capital. That's one of the novelties in the model. We have polluting capital with a P, so imagine coal power plants, gas guzzlers, and clean capital with a C, so imagine windmills and the electric vehicles, for instance. And then you can invest in those two types of capital, and the stock increases. And you can choose to use a fraction of this stock. You could use 100% of the windmills or just 80% of the windmills, same thing with the coal power plant. And then a key feature in the middle of the screen is that investment is irreversible, right? Once you build a coal power plant, you cannot unbuild it and recreate consumption out of it. Same with the windmill. So that's called putty clay investment in the literature. I think because if you invest time and money in pottery classes, there's no way you're gonna get that money back. It turns out that it's never optimal in the model to use not all of the windmills, not all of the clean capital, and also to try to disinvest from the renewable energy. So I'm going to ignore these equations in the next slides with equations. Now, to look at policy instruments, it's useful to break the economy in, on the one hand, an investor-consumer, and on the other hand, a producer. So for now, the investor-consumer, he's gonna do, it's the household. He's gonna try to maximize his utility, discounted utility over time until today and the end of time. And he's gonna get money from renting out the polluting capital and the clean capital at the rates are. And he's gonna use that money to consume, so utility, or invest in polluting or clean capital. Then the stocks of capital evolve usually, and he has a constraint that he cannot rent out more capital than what he has built with investments. And on the other side, you have a producer, who rents the capital to the household at the same rates, big R, and uses it to produce and to sell. And he's going to maximize that profit, which is the production minus what he pays in rent. And when you solve the laissez-faire equilibrium, so no climate change for now, you just like maximize everybody's point of view. As expected, you find that the rental rates of the clean and the polluting capital have to be equal between them. and they have to be equal to the marginal productivity of polluting capital and the marginal productivity of clean capital. So it's like very simple economics 101. Resources should be priced all the same and according to the marginal output, basically. And now we have climate change. So we have climate change by saying when you use the polluting capital, so think coal power plants, proportionally to what you use, that's going to emit emissions at a given factor, big G. And then those emissions accumulate over time. And the goal of the benevolent, the goal is going to be to maintain these emissions below a given carbon budget that basically represents the 1.5 or 2 degrees target. Right. So we first solve the problem from the perspective of the benevolent social planner. So I'm just going to repeat these equations. You see the utility of the household that you maximize discounted over time. And there's several accounting constraints. One is that the production is used for consumption, investment in polluting capital, investment in clean capital, investment in both types of capital increases the stock of those capitals. Utilization of polluting capital creates emissions that accumulate in the atmosphere. You want these emissions to be below a carbon budget. Investment cannot be negative, and you cannot use more capital than what you have. Right? That's the basic model, basically. So what we find in the paper is at the beginning, you don't have a lot of clean capital. We assume it's less productive of the polluting capital, and all your growth is based on increasing the stock of polluting capital over time. And then at the end, once you're done with the transition, you want to have only clean capital that continues growing at the exponential rate, while you have almost no polluting capital. And in the middle, which is the interesting part, you do two things. Basically, at a time that I denoted T0 in this slide, you suddenly realize that climate change is a thing that's dangerous. And you're a benevolent social planner, so what you immediately do is realize you've been building too much coal power plants in the past when you didn't know about climate change. So what you're going to do is you're going to suddenly start to invest a lot in clean capital, windmills, and also suddenly stop using some of those coal power plants. Because when you build them again, you didn't know climate change was a thing. So that's what creates the stranded assets. You immediately start using less coal power plants than what you would if you wanted to use all of them. And you stop investing in them because you have too much of them. So they decay at delta. I didn't mention it explicitly before, but I hope you noticed that the capital accumulation was investment minus delta K as usual. And at some point you now have at TI, you now are okay with the total stock of capital you have, and you just like go to a smooth phase down as you continue phasing in the renewable energy. And of course, a carbon tax can decentralize that equilibrium. So when you look at the carbon tax, the way it changes the laissez-faire equilibrium I showed you before is on the bottom left of this slide. Now the producer has to pay a carbon tax out of his profits to the amount, proportionally to the polluting capital that he uses, and therefore the carbon emissions that he emits. Notice quickly, I haven't said the consumer problem doesn't change at all. It's not affected directly by the carbon tax. And when we solve that in the paper, we find that now instead of the rental rates of capital being equal to the marginal productivity of capital, the one from the polluting capital has to be higher. It has to, the marginal productivity of capital has to pay for the rental rate and for the carbon tax. So you're going to use less coal power plants so that they're marginally more efficient, so that you justify both paying for the coal power plants and paying for the carbon tax. And we also find that the rental rates of capital are not equal anymore. The polluting capital can be paid less. And the amount of how much less that I denoted L here on the bottom right of the slide can basically be linked to the sorry, I forgot this. The Lagrange multiplier associated with the constraint that the investments in polluting capital cannot be negative. So basically this means you realize you have too much polluting capital, you would like to sell it off and maybe buy windmills with it, but you can't do that. So what you have to do is accept lower prices for your coal power plants for the producers to use. And so that's basically the monetization of the stranded assets for the owner of the polluting capital, and also show if you have way too much polluting capital and you don't use all of it, as I showed in the previous slide, then actually the rental rate goes to 0, which makes intuitive sense, at least if you're a PhD student in economics. So now in the last part of the paper, we say, okay, let's, for political reasons, let's avoid stranded assets. And in particular, let's force everybody to use all of the coal power plants. We don't want to suddenly lay off workers who work in coal power plants and close down all these communities. So I'm going to force the usage of all the coal power plants. The way it makes sense to model this is to add a constraint. So you have the physical constraint that you cannot use more capital than what you have. Q has to be lower than K. And then you have the political economic constraint that I'm just adding now that says I want to use all of it. And when we solve it, we find that now you still have a solution to that. Now it's called second best solution because it has an additional constraint. And when we compare it to the first best solution, you're not going to suddenly stop using all those coal power plants you just realized were a bad idea when you learned about climate change. And so emissions are not going to drop down as fast. Instead, they're going to be reduced as the coal power plants decay over time. And so in the short term, you have more emissions. In the long term, you have zero emissions. You have the same emissions. So in the middle term, at some point, you need to go below the emissions of the first best scenario. First best scenario. And then, of course, that's more expensive for society as a whole. That's what you see on the left part of the slide. When you look at the social cost of carbon, so just the marginal cost of the carbon budget, it's going to be higher at all time in the second best scenario, just because you have one more constraint. That's also basic economics. But that doesn't mean that the transition is going to be more costly for all generations. In the short term, now in the right side of the slide, you use all your coal power plants, so you can produce more than if you accepted to just stop using them. So the second best solution is more expensive in general for society. It's more expensive for the intertemporal consumer, but it's not necessarily more expensive for the short-term consumer. So that might make it more politically feasible. And finally, and that's going to be my last geeky slide, and then I'm going to go back to more words and less equations. We show how you can decentralize an equilibrium like this using, as I said at the beginning, instruments like fee-baits instead of instruments like a carbon tax. So a fee-bait doesn't affect the producer on the bottom left of your slide. It affects only the investor, the household on the top left of the slide in red. When the consumer wants to invest in polluting capital with a P, it has to pay a tax, theta P, on those investments. On the other hand, when he invests in clean capital, he gets a subsidy, theta C, for the cleaner capital. And when you solve this, basically what you find in the right-hand part of the slide is that it doesn't affect what we had found at the beginning. So you provide no incentive to underuse the polluting capital, and you provide no incentive to change the rents. The rents are going to be the same for the two types of capital. So basically, you're not producing stranded assets. So if I summarize now more with words and less equations, the findings of this paper, of course, carbon prices are the most efficient way in terms of intertemporal consumption maximization. By definition of just PIGU, you have one externality, you put the carbon tax bill. But they can do two things that are problematic: create stranded assets and underutilization of polluting capital, for instance, coal power plants. And again, that's efficient. You just realize, oh my God, I have too much of this. They create climate change. Let's stop using them now. But also means a sacrifice for the current generation who doesn't get to use them, and a big sacrifice for the owner of the coal power plants who don't make any money out of them anymore. And we contrast that with using second best instruments that might be more politically doable, but you actually just say, you know what, let's not change the rules in terms of what we do with existing stuff. But what we're going to do now is invest more in the clean stuff and stop investing at all in the dirty stuff. So more windmills, less coal power plants in the future. And that, of course, is going to be less efficient, more expensive, but it's not going to be it's not going to create any specific big loser in terms of one generation or one type of owners. This additional cost is spread over time and over everybody. So that was the paper in 10 minutes, I hope. And now I'm going to use 6 last minutes of my presentation to tell you how at the IDB, where I've been working for 5 years, I've seen how putting this in practice is actually more subtle and complex than what I showed in with these equations, because it's the real world. It's not a model with 5 equations. And for that, I want to take the example of the climate strategies that 3 countries in Latin America have announced in the last 2 years, including Costa Rica, which was the first one to do it, and Colombia in the middle and Chile on the right of this slide. Actually, this is going to take me much less than 6 minutes. So maybe let me tell you quickly, what is a long-term strategy? A long-term climate strategy. So what a long-term climate strategy is a document that says, okay, by 2050, in the long term, I want to be able to embrace, I want to embrace the green growth and the clean economy. So for instance, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels and it provides electricity without emitting CO2. So that's a benefit, and it's not a sacrifice in the long term, right? In the long term, I want that. And then the strategy says, okay, but today I don't have it. And transitioning from where I am today to where I want to go is gonna be challenging for technical and political economy reasons, for instance. So for instance, the renewable energy in the future might mean destroying the jobs of coal workers today. And it also might mean having a grid that's more difficult to manage because it has intermittent power. And then from this vision of where you want to go and this understanding of the obstacles, what a good long-term strategy does is build a sequence of objectives and goals for the government to do measures and policy reforms to remove those barriers, right? So for instance, say, I don't want to go tomorrow to 100% renewable energy, maybe 30% by 2030 and 80% by 2040, something like that. And then I know that over time, I will need to invest, for instance, in transmission lines to accommodate the variable power, and invest in a fund to help the workers affected by the phase down of coal power plants to find a new job, for instance. So that's in a nutshell what those strategies are. And I'm just going to quickly keep the example of the Costa Rican decarbonization strategy, just to say it actually says, it basically does what I just said. It says by 2050, I want to go to net zero emissions. 2020, this is where my emissions come from in terms of sectors. And so basically, I need to reduce emissions from all the sectors over time. And what you see in violet in the negative numbers is improve reforestation rates to basically compensate for the residual emissions. And then sector by sector, it plans for a smooth transition over time and policy measures to use immediately. So one example, and I'm done. Public transportation, the Costa Rica plan wants to get to a country by 2050 where everybody takes electric buses as the #1 option to move from point A to point B in the country. That again, you cannot do this in 24 hours. So maybe 30% of electric buses by 2035, which is the target they have, is a good midpoint. And then once you're talking about electric vehicles, electric buses in this case, you can ask, why do I not have electric buses today? And they don't have electric buses today because the drivers are not used to that technology. And so maybe pilot projects where you give them electric buses and you let them use them for a few weeks is one thing that goes in that direction, right? And then the price of the bus ticket is regulated in the country. And today it depends on how much you spend on diesel and how much you spend on oil. And the formula doesn't say how much you spend on electricity and how much you spend on batteries. So you have to think about a new business model for to regulate the price of buses when your buses are electric buses. And these are very simple examples, right? I'm just trying to tell you what the governments find as specific barriers usually they require much more concrete and boring solutions than something as a high level as I showed in the second presentation of my slide, in the second part of my presentation. And now just to say, okay, I give you the example of electric buses, but for instance, what they did in Costa Rica also has something similar with reforestation. They have reforestation targets and say, okay, maybe if we want people to reforest, we need to subsidize reforestation for all the farmers. And that means we need to find money for that. And then those are just two examples, but there's actually like 10 lines of actions, like reforestation and electric buses in the plan, and more than 80 policy reforms that they have identified is needed to enable all of that transformation in all of those areas. So that's basically what I wanted to tell you today, right? So first of all, I said, the science tells us we need to go to net zero emissions. It's technically doable, but there are a lot of challenges, and one of the challenges is stranded assets. And then I talked about how carbon prices, of course, are going to be efficient from the perspective of economic theory, but one downside they have is they create the stranded assets. So maybe instead of carbon prices as the blanket solution, the governments are going to need to think about, in the example I gave you, subsidizing investment in clean technology and discouraging investments in polluting technology. But then if you generalize even more, there's not just clean and polluting capital in an economy. There's a lot of sectors that produce emissions. And I think I showed you with the example of Costa Rica, that when you think of each one of these sectors and how to do the transition, and in practical terms, the governments are going to find a lot of different small problems, barriers to the transition, and they're going to need necessarily to implement a lot of different policy measures in different sectors, basically to try to smooth a transition to net zero emissions and make it happen in a just and inclusive way. I hope that was not too much, and you kind of got what I wanted to say. Super eager to hear the discussion by Professor Xepapadeas. I hope I'm pronouncing this okay. And thanks again very much for the time.
Okay, thank you for your time. Okay, now I leave the floor to Professor Xepapadeas for his comment.
So, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, see. Yeah.
Good, thank you. To start with, let me say that it's a great pleasure to be in FEAM, either as a discussant or as a presenter. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be here. I would also like to thank Adrian for this very interesting presentation and very interesting topic. Stranded assets, it's really important. I mean, Adrian presented the issue from the point of view of the owners and the losses that the owners might have if the assets become stranded. But there's also further issue with stranded assets, and it has to do with the banking sector. I mean, central banks are worried that if there is an issue with stranded assets and the banking system is exposed to these assets, then when these assets go stranded, they might not be able to service debts, and there might be also some kind of instability into the system. So this is an important issue and needs to be discussed. Also, there's these issues of job losses in coal mining areas. In Greece, my country, we have this problem because now we're trying to go through low carbon technologies, and part of our energy system was based on lignite use. Lignite is a form of coal which is really dirty, and there's lots of discussion now how jobs lost in the areas where are producing lignite will be replaced, and there are big plans, investment plans in renewable energy that might sort of generate new jobs. So this is an issue that we'll keep discussing, and we need trying to find a solution. On the other hand, however, regarding especially the owners of the coal the coal-fired power plants. In terms of economics, I wouldn't sort of worry that much, because the way that goes, it's a Higgs-Kaldor test. I mean, there will be losers, there will be gainers, and if the social benefits are higher, then in principle we should go ahead and stop these kinds of power plants from expanding. So this is one part, the part of political economy. Now, going into the paper, which is kind of interesting. Yes, the paper is I enjoyed reading it, especially because there's that reference in Arrow and Kurt's book in 1970. It's a very important book because Ken Arrow and Kurt set in this book presenting lots of new results about the optimal control. These days, optimal control was not so much, nobody was so much familiar with optimal control these days, and Ken Arrow with this book and Kurt's made a great job in bringing new knowledge to the profession. So the paper basically studies a climate policy with clean and dirty capital, and dirty capital generates emissions. Then it introduces an important constraint in the problem, which has to do with the accumulation of carbon. Okay, and this constraint implicitly, although it's not spelled out explicitly in the paper, relates to the temperature targets, which could be 1.5 of 2%. So implicitly, there is a relationship there that connects the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere with the change in temperature relative to the pre-industrial period. So the objective is to examine how we might avoid some kind of early premature retirement of dirty capital, which in this case might be inefficient. So I think this is the whole idea. So there is a comparison of laissez-faire and social and the planner's optimum, and the structure there is Arrow Kurtz 1970. The paper is published in JIM, so basically what I'm going to present in the next couple of slides are basically potential extension and clarification for the paper. Okay. Now, what I want to ask Adrian and see how the reaction is the following. The paper introduces that climate constraint, but there are no other link, at least as far as I could see, of climate with the economy. So there's no damage function to the problem. Okay, typically in these kinds of problems, the damage function appears either multiplicative in the production function. I mean, there's lots of papers. Golosov et al. Paper in Econometrica is one of the exams of these issues. And in the framework of the paper, this damage function will be regarded as exogenous by the decision makers. It's an externality for them, but this damage function should be internalized by the social planner. So there must be a kind of endogeneity between the constraint constant and the path of greenhouse gases approaching the upper bound of the constraint and the production. This is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that Arrow and Kurtz in their paper, in their book, they have done another innovation apart from using optimal control theory and introducing optimal control theory. What they did was to introduce Arrow and Kurtz have two types of capital, private and private. In our case, one type of capital is dirty, one is clean. So Arrow and Kurtz introduced the public capital in the utility function as a positive externality. So in this model, one could introduce clean capital in the utility function, which is taken into account by the social planner, because clean capital will reduce social cost by reducing emission. So this is one issue, one comment regarding to the paper. So the question is there, if there is a damage function in the model, what kind of change will do to the path of stranded assets? Because without damage, I think that my intuition that the optimal path will come close. The optimal path for emissions will come close to the upper bound, to the constraint, and will remain there forever, to the steady state. If you have damages, it might delay, which means that climate damages might be reduced overall along the path to the steady state. That was one issue. The other issue is the following. I will be curious, and I want to ask Adrian whether they calibrated the model with numbers, with realistic numbers, because here I put the IPCC results. It's the same from the same study that Adrian put earlier, that indicates that if we follow the business as usual scenario, then the 1.5 threshold will be crossed around 2040. So in the model without policy, do you have any idea when the threshold will be crossed, the threshold of the carbon budget? That's one question. And finally, and that's where I end, there's lots of uncertainty to the problem, okay? There's lots of uncertainty because accumulation of greenhouse gases is stochastic. Also, we have reversibility. Irreversibility and uncertainty provides very interesting issues in investment analysis. We have deep uncertainty, ambiguity aversion probably. And these factors should be also interested in trying to understand what kind of impact will have on this issue of stranded assets. Will indicate that we should take strong action now and stop these assets and retire these assets because we need to take the strong action now in order to avert earlier possible crossing of thresholds, tipping points, and that are part of these large uncertainties that relate to both the evolution of greenhouse gases, but more importantly, to damages as we move towards the 1.5 or the 1.2. And I would finish by also being a little bit pessimistic, since although Adrian said, and I agree with him, that technically might be possible to attain these net zero targets, the emission gaps that are observed, even with the commitments of the Paris Agreement, indicates that we should be more ambitious and try to take strong action now, one. And second, that since climate change is around, is here, I mean, you can see what happened to the United States a couple of days ago with these tornadoes, whether in the models that we built now, these analytical integrated assessment models, whether we should introduce more seriously adaptation as a defensive measure against the climate change, which I believe is already on top of us. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anastasios. Me too. I have to say that are very, very important issues to face. So me too was also thinking about uncertainty and also adaptation. But now I will leave the floor to Adrian to answer to this point.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this great discussion. I'm still taking notes. I think you make a lot of extremely relevant comments and questions. I guess let me take them not necessarily in the order you asked them. Or maybe I can actually try to do it in the order. The first question you asked was if instead of exogenous carbon budgets, we had damages, would that change a lot the dynamic? So you know, we tried to build the smallest model that would be analytically tractable and that would make that point for the political economy and the dynamic that there are two completely qualitative different ways of reducing emissions. One is through investments that you do today and have an impact for the long term in the future. And one is from operational, so like building windmills. And one is for operational decisions, like deciding to use less coal power plants today and more gas power plants and more renewable energy today from an existing stock. And how a carbon price, of course, like, you know, tells the decentralized equilibrium, use those two levers in an equimarginal fashion. But these two levers have, let's say, qualitatively different impacts on the total cost and on the political economy that we just hint. And so I think if you put damages in the model, it doesn't change these two things. In particular, you proposed a multiplicative damage. If instead of a multiplicative damage, you have a production function unchanged minus damages that depend on M, I believe when you do the equations, the derivative of the damages, you know, d prime M, is going to play the exact same role that I don't remember if it was mu or tau played in our model. So I think basically replacing the arbitrary carbon budget with an optimal, you know, M star, like that has an impact on all the rest of the system through, you know, the marginal damage instead of having the social cost of carbon. And I think that would be exactly the same for the rest. Go ahead.
I meant to have both of them in the model, to have both the carbon budget and the damage function, because as you approach the upper bound of the budget, you generate damages.
Yeah.
So it's going to be optimal to keep away from the budget, because this way you might reduce damages. That was my point, to have both of them there, to have both to have both the damage function and the budget constraint. The budget constraint is very good. It's a very good device because it's very policy relevant. So
I understand. I think for the dynamic of the model, again, if instead of multiplicative, as you suggest, is a good suggestion by the way, but if you had the urge to simplify the calculations that I would have done at the time and use an additive one, I believe from top of my head that what they would create is either the damages are so important that you prefer a lower end, and so the other one is not binding, or which wouldn't happen for 1.5, I think, or they just add up, and what you find is just a more urgent situation. And at some point, I didn't show this today, but in the model, we try to solve it analytically and just say what happens for very binding carbon budgets and for very loose carbon budgets. And then we have like a phase diagram where you have three kind of cases. I believe the case you suggest would not change that. It would just change when you try to empirically, you know, do numerical simulations that are calibrated. Then of course it would change where you are. But instead of our more general study of the kind of situation we can have in terms of the transition dynamic, I expect it would be the same. I wanted to say about your suggestion to use the utility that depends on clean capital. So maybe you're going to say the same thing, that in addition. So if it's in addition, and
it's in addition.
Yeah, of course, that would make sense, I think. And just to show, but yeah, you just find you want to invest more in clean capital, right? And so be more urgent, which I think is relevant in the real world, right? I think in the real world, that's a lot of what we do in our conversation with developing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that I tried to suggest at the beginning of my presentation. You know, renewable energy, efficient bus that means that people can get to work and breathe clean air instead of wasting the time in traffic and you know, being sick. That's just good even without climate change. And so in the real world, there's a lot of inefficiencies in the energy system that you could try to solve. Of course, there are reasons, right? So you cannot just like solve them like this. But if you understand what are the barriers to having efficient energy and transport systems, there's benefits of having clean energy systems even without the climate change that would add to that. You asked about the threshold. So when we did the paper, so by the way, and I know there are some PhD students, we wrote the paper in 2014, and then we really wanted to publish it in a good journal. So it was finally accepted, I think, 4 years later, and published in, I think, 2019 for the first time online, and it shows us 2020 as the print version. So just saying, sometimes if your goal is to do a tier 1 journal, sometimes you're gonna need to like try. So in 2014, when we calibrated the model, we show empirical evidence that 2 degrees, which was the target discussed then, was probably doable even if you didn't want to early scrap or strand any coal power plant and the dirty assets in the world. That's from a paper by Davis in Nature. But probably it was optimal in the transition to do some stranded assets. If you did this today, which we haven't, there's 2 things that have changed. One is that the stock of capital, the dirty capital, has increased exponentially. And now instead of 2C, we talk more about 1.5C. So I would say today it's probably optimal to, I mean, certainly optimal to do stranded assets in the transition. And it's not clear, you know, maybe it's doable without doing any stranded assets, but I wouldn't bet it's doable. And I guess that's a link with the stochastic approach, right? In reality, we don't know, right? It's not actually one carbon budget that we know for sure. It's like, oh, maybe it's 800 gigas, maybe it's 1200 gigas. And that's exactly the kind of things you would put, I think, in a stochastic model where you say either the damages or the threshold come from a thing you don't know exactly. I think you would just find, if you do that, well, the model is more difficult to solve. And but also it just, all of these things tell you, if you compare them with the average carbon budget or the average damages, that you need to do more precautionary investments in clean capital and precautionary underuse of existing coal power plants today. So it would just like move the 2 things in that order. Yeah, I don't know. I've stopped doing this kind of things like 5 years ago, but I don't know if now we can solve this analytically in a good way. It used to be that people put them in MATLAB and just got the numerical results. So I think that's what you would get for the numerical results. And of course, in the real world, because of all of that, we also need to adapt, right? And the good news is in the real world, I would say there's a lot of emphasis in both adaptation and decarbonization, so resilience and decarbonization. The big difficulty with adaptation, by the way, is that it's very difficult to measure. So for instance, if you are like building dikes to protect a city from ocean floods, and what does it mean to build it because of climate change versus without climate change, you already have the floods from time to time, right? So, you know, if you had perfect information, you could say, without climate change, I need a 1.5 meter dike. With climate change, I need a 2 meter dike. And you could say then the half a meter difference is adaptation to climate change. But in practice, what you see is engineers, they just built a 3 meter dike because they don't know and they want to be safe, right? And so when they do that, you cannot tell what portion of that is adaptation. I am personally of the opinion that you shouldn't try to. In the same way, when you invest in solar panels, you don't say some of it is for electricity production, some of it is for mitigation. You just say this is an investment in clean energy, period. Anything that reduces the impact of droughts, floods, natural disasters that can be linked to climate change. In the context of my job, which is like to understand how much funding we're providing to adapt to climate change to the developing countries, probably simpler would be my personal opinion to just like make big categories. If I may use 1 minute to say, because I know there's PhD students in the room, my own opinion about how this work could be moved forward, I would say put uncertainty in the political system. So the carbon tax to work for investments in a model like this one, it has to be perfectly credible, right? So you have the social planner or the government that says the carbon tax is going to grow at 4% per year forever. But in the real world, you could have someone who says that, and then next year, at the end of the day, they don't do it because of whatever, you know, like the Gilets jaunes in France, at the end, they didn't increase the carbon tax, or the government changes and doesn't increase the carbon tax. So you could have a model simple where you have two parties, the Green Party and the Brown Party, and the Green Party is really committed to put the carbon tax and grow over time, but the Brown Party is committed to remove it. And there's a flip of a coin chance that either one wins the next election, and the private sector knows that. So they know the carbon tax is maybe a promise for future carbon taxes, maybe not. And the Green Party also know they know, right? So I think if you do a model like this, the Green Party wants to put a very high carbon tax to compensate for the half chance that it doesn't win next time. But that creates more stranded assets in the short term. Or they can use subsidies for clean investment today that have an impact today, even if the Brown Party wins tomorrow. So that's again a setup where those two instruments are qualitatively different. And I think a reason why we see them in the real life, you know, like subsidies for electric vehicles, you buy your electric vehicle today, tomorrow you change the government, it changes the price of oil, you still have your electric vehicle. You're not gonna unbuild it. So it's the subsidies, the instruments that affect investments, or the ban on new exploration for oil. So either banning new investments in brown or subsidizing new investment in clean is a way to commit your price signals into that you cannot commit in the futures because maybe you're going to be removed from office. I think that's very interesting, and I would have done this paper 3 years ago if I was still in academia, but now it's absolutely no chance I have time. But if someone in the room wants to try to do it and keep me in the loop, I would totally be up for that.
Okay, Casey, thank you for your reply. And I don't know if there are if Anastasia would like to comment more. Otherwise, we can also collect if there are some questions.
I'm fine. Okay. I mean, thank you, Andrew, for your comments and the replies. They're very insightful. Yeah, I don't have anything else to say. Maybe we open the discussion to the floor. It might be more interesting.
Perfect. So I have to say that it's very, very interesting also in general. So because we are speaking about something that is also, so in my point of view is this stranded asset in general. So this process in order to have this, so from one end phasing out, to the other end this process of decarbonizing to move with NZE, so net zero emission, is the process should be a smooth one. And so having this kind of spike, of this jump that you have shown, could have also some effect on the economy processes. So if you in your jumps, I think in some cases you have also some damages in terms of economic structure, or not. If it's, so, for example, you should have some losses. I don't know if it's very easy to have a manner in order to recover this is a smooth one path, even if I understand there is a movement from one situation you are a structure with a brown energy and another one to green energy. Maybe in the middle you could have this jump that can cause some economical damages in general, not social costs, but or more wider in the sense of economics costs. So this is what I have in mind now, because it's a debate that is in these days. This is one of the things that I have in mind. The second is related to the capacity. So it's feasible, so it's doable, it could be, but if you look at in a wide, so can I say, in a macroeconomic structure, if you look at the microeconomics, so it's small different situations. So for example, in Italy, we need 8 gigawatt in order to be in line with a net zero emission. So it's a wider question, this one. No? In one case, we have some problem in order to create the capacity in order to have a phase out process of a new technology process. So this is also a problem related to the installing capacity even if I can say in a macroeconomic point of view is doable from a feasibility in terms of can I say a real structure of the market is not so easy. My viewpoint, my point of view. About adaptation, I think about a manner, but I don't know. It could be also to link damage with so the damage. If you introduce the damage function in the model, you should have also maybe I don't know the subsidy, so the amount of money in order to know how much could be a part of adaptation. So the damage is exactly what is the new world in which you should adapt. But I understand it's very, very complicated. This last point, I don't know. There are only very, very quick comments. Okay, not exactly question. A lot of a long list of comments. Also because I think it's very interesting also to study more in depth this because in general I work on all macroeconomic models, integrated assessment model, or also real option approach. So approaches that are not a general equilibrium model, but partial equilibrium models on investment, irreversibility, and also uncertainty. So I'm thinking about an optimal stopping time, so an optimal process in order to have a new entity of a new type of energy in this process, maybe introducing uncertainty, not only political one, but also technological. You should have different optimal entries because maybe they are not exactly today or tomorrow following a rule of net present value, but are different types. But anyway, a very our comments. Okay, I don't know. It's a very long list. Maybe after I can send to you some comments by writing to you because they are very interesting point in order to debate. So if I leave you the floor, if you have some comments, please.
I can like react to two of these things, right? So in the paper, when you suddenly discover that climate change is a thing and you stop using coal power plants, the rental value of these coal power plants drops to zero. If the coal power plants were exchanged in financial markets, there would be a crash in financial markets. But something that happens in the model that if you just if you try to interpret it as a financial market, the clean power plants are also exchanged in the financial market, and they immediately appreciate a lot. And so you have two effects. One is that first of all, you discover you're a bit poorer than you thought because you didn't know that climate change was a thing, and now you know that climate change is a thing. So the total stock market should go down, right? Because you just realize, oh my God, this is going to cost me in the future. And that happens, but it's the only thing that happens in the model. While in the real world, the financial market or the upstream capacity you mentioned in your second comment don't have, I think, the capacity to immediately adjust from all the fossil fuel power plants are worthless to all the green industry is knowably better now. So what would be interesting is the model, I think, like this, where you have some kind of transaction costs, either for the financial people in banks to figure out this is a real renewable energy company that's going to be profitable in the future. This is one that's just like selling buzzwords, and you don't have the total information to know that. So I think if you do that, you will have a bigger drop in the market, right? You have the drop that says now we prove because of climate change, and you have a drop that says now we prove because we used to know the fossil fuel energies and the business models, etc., from a financial perspective, and now we have to learn about the green markets, and we don't learn yet, so we have to invest something that needs to be in the model to then be as comfortable trading green stuff that we were comfortable trading brown stuff. I think that would be cool, actually. And it would give you the same thing, I believe, from intuitively, that if instead of looking at the financial sector, you say you cannot invest directly the product of the F function into clean or dirty. You have to build an upstream company, right? You have to build the universities for polluting industries and the universities for clean industries, and you have to build lines of production for electric cars and the lines of production for gasoline cars before you can have the green cars or the back car. So this would capture the idea of there's a lot of inertia and you cannot just adjust from I don't invest in one and invest in the other. But then you would have 4 different timelines in the model, so it's really difficult to track, right? Because now you have investment goes into capital goes in production, which is emissions, and emissions goes in the emission stock. So you have 3 stocks that are like one above the other. And I'm saying it would make sense to have another stock either of knowledge of the financial service sector. That was my first thing. Or now a stock of like capacity to actually build the clean and dirty stuff. I think conceptually it would be good. I don't know if it's tractable. I've never managed back in the days to have a model where you have 4 stocks and you can do things. But I haven't tried a lot either, so I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you. No, I understand. Okay, if now looking at if there are some other questions. Okay, perfect. So otherwise, I would like to thank you all. I will write to you to speak about also this. I would like to thank you, Adrian, and also thank you, Anastasios, for this, and also all the participants that attended to us and this very interesting paper and very inspiring debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you. Bye.